Hello and welcome back to the EPRS series on EU defense. My name is Dan Sabovitz, here in the European Parliament to speak with experts of the European Parliamentary Research Service. In the last two episodes, we discussed current challenges to the EU defense industry and the tools the EU has for supporting it. In this new episode, we will focus on what lies ahead. How is Europe preparing for the next chapter of its security threats? We are recording this conversation in the early days of the new US administration. This will undoubtedly have implications for European defense, which is being discussed by EU leaders in the European Council. The war in Ukraine continues, the ceasefire in Gaza remains fragile, but one important element which is emerging from Brussels is the upcoming white paper on the future of European defense by the European Commission and the European External Action Service. Why is this white paper so important for decrypting the new European approach for defense? We're about to find out. I'm joined in the studio by Elena Lazaro, geopolitics and defense expert at the EPRS. Hello, Elena.
Hi, Dan. Nice to see you.
So you've been engaging with many of the authors of this new white paper to write up your own analysis about it. So what is a white paper on defense and why is it so important in the context of current geopolitical developments?
Well, thank you for that. And indeed, I think, if anything, it is white paper on defense season in Brussels, in the Brussels bubble. It has, in fact, been since President von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, announced her political guidelines, and she committed to producing this white paper on the future of EU defense within the first 100 days, which are coming up quite soon,
already?
Actually, in early March.
Okay.
So we are expecting this to come up quite soon. And she tasked the new High Representative Vice President for Foreign Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, and the new first ever Commissioner for Defense, Andrius Kubilius, by the way, both of them former members of the European Parliament, to produce this strategy. But of course, you know, the writing of this white paper on defense is happening simultaneously across several places, in Brussels, in the External Action Service, in the DG for Defense, Industry and Space, in the Secretariat General of the Commission itself. And we are all expecting to see the outcome, all of us who work on defense, and I would argue even further than that, because as we'll discuss, it also has implications for industry. And we are expecting to see that come up in March, as I said. Now, of course, there's a number of details which we'll be discussing, but it is important to say, to address these details and to get member state consensus on them, we'll be seeing ahead of the presentation of the white paper an informal gathering of EU leaders, convened by President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, to sort out the final details, I suppose.
Because it's unprecedented, because it's the first time we have a European white paper on defense.
It is the first time we have a white paper, an EU white paper on the future of EU defense. We had a reflection white paper on the future of EU defense under the Juncker Commission, but it was a very different type of white paper. And maybe this is a point where we should also say the term white paper is not always used to mean the same things.
It sounds very technical jargon, but I mean, is it binding? This white paper comes out and then what? All of Europe will have to follow whatever is in there?
So first of all, to say, white papers of the Commission, which is a separate animal, are basically proposals for action which the Commission usually issues ahead of issuing legislation or action plans in several areas. And usually these are produced, they're out for consultation, and then whatever comes out of them is embedded into the legislation, and then that, when voted, is binding. But this is a very different thing. This is a white paper on defense. In many ways, it's a term that is being drawn from strategic and military documents of countries, states. And what happens usually in these white papers that several countries around the world have, including several member states of the EU, is they translate political priorities and military political priorities into actionable operational actions. So basically what you have in a white paper is the objectives of a given actor, but how do you actually get to them in terms of industrial, military and other purposes?
So now you got me very curious, and I know that before you published your own analysis, you've been running around Brussels and you've
do research, that's what we do.
You've done your research, you spoke with all the people who are working on the white paper, maybe even fed them with some ideas, they gave you some insight. So what do we know? What can we expect to find in this white paper that doesn't sound technical to me anymore? Now I'm eager to find it. What will be in there?
So first of all, I didn't speak with all of them. I tried to find out what was happening, because we have to say that EPRS started working on this paper on the white paper quite ahead of many others.
Paper on the paper.
The paper on the paper, the briefing on the paper.
Is it somebody writing a paper on your paper on the paper?
I'm sure there are. But at that stage, in the announcement of the political guidelines, we actually worked on this paper before even the confirmation of the commissioners. So we were also feeding it into the process of the hearings of the commissioners by
But after the von der
Parliament.
Leyen announced that there would
Yes, so the political guidelines were announced, but the commissioners had not been confirmed at the time. So we were ahead of the confirmation of the commissioners when we wrote this paper.
and the identity of these people has an impact on what they will actually
Well,
write.
we knew who they would be if confirmed, but the work had started already in the services. So what will be in there? It didn't just come out in my discussions, but I would say it's very clear when one looks at the political guidelines and the mission letters to the commissioners at the time, commissioners to be, what would have been in there. Basically, what President von der Leyen announced in the political guidelines is basically the next step towards what we call a European Defence Union. And what this means is for the EU to be able to be prepared for the most extreme military contingencies. That's what she said. Now, what does this translate to? It translates into three categories of things. It translates into industrial readiness, so the capacity to produce the defense capabilities that are needed. It translates into having and procuring the necessary capabilities, the necessary enablers, and the necessary tools to carry out this.
To tell the audience that we were diving into these topics in the 2 previous episodes of this trilogy on defense.
Exactly, and my
your
colleagues have
colleagues.
discussed this a lot. And strategies on they're about and the legislation that is being proposed. So we have capabilities, we have industrial capacity, and then we also have the big question, investment and financing. How do we finance the European defense industry to produce these capacities, and how does the EU support member states to the degree that it can in order to procure
So
these
Elena,
capabilities?
give me a teaser. How do we finance?
Well,
defense?
I should say that that will be decided by the leaders, and that is really the question that we'll all be waiting for. But what we can say, I think, and it's interesting, is that this conversation is not happening in a vacuum. And as we mentioned in the briefing, it happens against the backdrop of 3 very important reports on competitiveness, on the single market, and on preparedness by Mario Draghi, by Enrico Letta, and by Sauli Niinisto. And what we can see particularly in the first 2 is proposals about how to boost the single market, but also boost competitiveness, including in the defense industry, which hold the potential to be globally competitive and to employ a lot of EU citizens. How, though, do we procure this investment for the defense industry? How do we go after this investment for the defense industry? So the Draghi report and the Letta report outline a number of proposals that will be discussed among the member states. One of them would be to issue common debt in the form of, defense bonds for the EU. Another one would be to increase the amount for defense in the multi-annual financial framework, so the next multi-annual financial framework. We're currently in the 2027 one. The next one, discussions on the next multi-annual financial framework will start very soon. The third proposal would be, of course, to enable financial institutions such as the European Investment Bank to invest more in defense, and that's a discussion ongoing, including on specifically dual-use items, so items that are used for civilian and military purposes. And then, of course, how to raise private capital, how to incentivize private capital to invest in defense industry, which has been a long-standing issue discussed, including in this House under the previous legislature. So these are some of the proposals on the table, of course.
So these million-dollar questions, how difficult is it going to be for the member states, for the frugal countries and the big spender countries to agree on that? It sounds like quite a heated debate. Or are they kind of converging because of the imminent threat that is emerging?
I would say there has been discussion, debate. Obviously, increasing debt does also come with its own challenges. Yeah. And by the same token, other proposals on the table come with other challenges. But I think there is an increasing consensus, and we've also worked on this a lot in EPRS on our work on the strategic compass. There is an increasing consensus in the necessity to do more on defense. The geopolitical environment is, I think, unanimously seen by the member states as one of great threat and need to boost the EU's defense, but also its resilience to hybrid threats. We've seen recently several attacks on hybrid infrastructure, undersea, cyber. So there is an understanding among member states that there needs to be more investment in defense. At the same time, you mentioned in the beginning, we are filming this 10 days, actually, not even 10 days after the inauguration of the new American president, who has himself made a case for an increase of defense spending. So I think...
Is he being heard?
Well, we will see. The leaders are meeting next week, but what can I say is, what I can say at this moment is that Secretary General of NATO, of which most EU member states are members, has seemed to respond positively to this in the sense of saying, yes, we also recognize in Europe that we will need to increase defense spending.
And the Secretary General of NATO happens to be a former Prime Minister of an EU
indeed.
member state. I would say a frugal one, but...
He does indeed. But also if you look at the statistics, if you look at EU member state defense spending over the past 4 years, and even more so if you take 2022 as a point of start, of departure, there has been a substantial increase in defense spending. And I should add to this that there has been EU seed money, sort of EU incentives at the EU level for defense industry, but also for common procurement of ammunition, for example, of 155 millimeter shells. So there has been a tendency to increase defense spending across the board in EU member states. So, to your question, that would probably suggest that, yes, there is consensus on the need to do so. How to do so
how and how much?
There are proposals on the table.
It's in the details. So just a technical question. You mentioned the white paper, you mentioned the discussions in the council. Which one is feeding which? Are the leaders going to discuss the white paper, or are they feeding into the white paper, or is it a bit of both?
So what we know at the moment is that the leaders are informally meeting on the 3rd of February. We should say we're filming this at the end of January, but we already mentioned the inauguration, so one can deduct when we're filming. And then the presentation of the white paper is due in the first 100 days, so that would take us roughly to the beginning of March. And then there is a European Council on the 19th of March, if I'm not mistaken, and there we would assume that it will be presented to the leaders. So what feeds into which, this is sort of a chicken and egg question.
Everybody's talking to each other now.
Everyone is talking about this.
The town is small.
And I think generally everyone is talking about it, but everyone agrees that it will need to address, I think this is the important point to re-emphasize, capability needs, industrial capacity, investment needs, and also, because we haven't mentioned it so far, partnerships. The EU-NATO partnership specifically, but more broadly than that, security and defense partnerships that can feed into procuring, acquiring, producing the necessary capabilities, but also creating a security environment which is conducive to the EU's security and defense goals. So in the past year, if you allow me, because we recently also published on this, the EU has launched...
We being the EPRS.
The EPRS has launched a new model of tailored bilateral security and defense partnerships. It's already signed 6 of those with Norway, Moldova, Korea, Japan, Albania, and North Macedonia. My understanding is looking forward there will be more. And it's interesting to interrelate those both to the white paper, but also to the issues that I mentioned before, so industry and capability.
You mentioned the debates between the institutions, between the member states, but I guess it gets even more complicated because the white paper will also have a lot of links to other policies like industrial and budgetary issues and competitiveness. Competitiveness is now the new buzzword. So can you tell me about the links to other policy fields and how they feed into each other?
Yes, of course. So everything that's been happening on EU defense policy, and you've discussed this in previous episodes of this video series, since I would say 2017 more or less, so really since the first actions on the defense fund were launched, everything that has been happening since then has allowed the EU to support the defense industry through the relevant treaty article that gives the EU competence for industrial policy. Because we have to remind the audience that the treaty on the EU prohibits financing from the EU budget for operations with military implications. So when we look at the EU level initiatives, what has been happening essentially through the European Defence Fund, the European Defence Action Plan, the more recent initiatives on defence industrial renewal through Procurement Act, all of this has been based on the idea that the EU is able through its budget to support its industry to be competitive. This is what the treaty allows the EU to do.
And not to feed direct funds into the industry.
No, it can feed to the industry, but what it cannot do is fund military operations directly. So it's a very big debate, but the reason I'm mentioning this treaty provision is to say the EU level policies on defense that are funded by the EU budget, and you've discussed this with my colleague in previous episodes, are basically both defense initiatives but also industrial policy initiatives. And this means that there is a very big interlinkage between the industrial policy and the defense policy, including here in the Parliament, where on files like the European Defense Industrial Renewal through Procurement Act and the Act in Support for Ammunition Procurement, these are acts that we had at the end of the last legislature. Both the ITRE committee, so the committee responsible for industry, but also the Foreign Affairs Committee and Security and Defense Committee and the Internal Market Consumer Committee, all of these have been involved in one way or another. So indeed it is a multi-area policy to support the defense industry.
Defense doesn't happen in a silo, it has a lot of linkage to other policy fields.
Of course, and because Draghi himself in the report makes it clear that supporting the defense industry is not just support for the EU's defense policy, but it is also a way to increase competitiveness, to support R&D, innovation, create jobs. Let's not forget that the defense industrial landscape in the EU is a mix of big companies, primes, but also mid-caps, and a very big number of innovative small and medium-sized enterprises. And all the proposals by the Commission make sure that they also benefit from this. It's not just defense policy and security, it's also employment, it's research and innovation, it's upskilling, it is supporting as well the industry.
So as we're nearing the end of this conversation, we start off by talking about the white paper of defense. You mentioned mostly the Commission, the External Action, the Council, to bring it back to this House, to this institution, to the European Parliament. You just touched upon some of the committees, but how is the Parliament going to address the white paper once it's out?
It's a very good question that you asked this, and can I also say very timely, because our Security and Defense former subcommittee just had its first meeting as a Security and Defense full committee yesterday. For the first time. So we're expecting to see a lot in that sense. But beyond, the committee, whether it is subcommittee or committee, I think the Parliament has had a very important role in this whole conversation, going very back to 2013 and 2016. The Parliament was already calling for a European Defence Union. It was calling for a Defence Commissioner. It was calling for first a white book on defence, then a white paper on defence. So a lot of the calls of the Parliament
took a while to get what they wanted.
But they have materialized.
It's a different Parliament by now, new mandate.
We're two legislatures later, but it has materialized. And what we see now in the annual reports on the security and defense policy, what we saw in the last legislature, because we haven't had one yet under the current one, is, this continued calls. The Parliament has asked for a renewed threat assessment of the EU 27 in what we call the strategic compass process. It has asked for the debate on the defense budget to go forward, increasing the defense budget in the next MFF. In terms of the white paper, of course, the white paper is not legislation, so we don't have a co-decision role, but we do have co-decision in a number of initiatives that will be part of the white paper. So, for example, the European Defence Industrial Programme that you've discussed with my colleague Sebastian, 1.5 billion, and with the discussion about increasing that financial amount in the next multi-annual financial framework. And that will be a process in which Parliament will be very vocal and will have a significant role. What will be the amount dedicated to defense spending in the next multi-annual financial framework? So a co-legislator role there too. And finally, to add, of course, that through all the oversight and scrutiny processes, hearings, questions, oral and written questions, question time with the High Representative and the Defence Commissioner, there is a lot that Parliament does and continues to do on overseeing this process and making sure that it is consistent with the treaties, but also with the stated defence and security goals of the EU.
In other words, this white paper on defence, which the Parliament has waited for so long to get, is a major milestone, but it's not the end, it's the beginning of all these debates that you mentioned that will happen among other places here in the European Parliament.
Well, it is, I would say, not the absolute beginning, but it's
a milestone,
the milestone in the process of something much bigger and something that should lead not only to strategy, but also to concrete operational capacity, be that, an air defense shield, be that more cyber defense capacity. Parliament will be very involved in overseeing that this is implemented in the stated way of the Commission. It is, after all, the role, right? watchdog oversee.
The watchdog of European democracy. Thank you, Elena, for presenting your findings, and your briefing on the upcoming white paper on the future of European defense is available on the website of the European Parliament. As we've just heard, Europe's defense strategy is taking shape to address the challenges of the shifting geopolitical landscape. This House, the European Parliament, will play an important role to ensure the success of this new strategy. Thank you for watching this third episode on European defense. You can find all our chronicles on the EPRS YouTube channel for more insights into how the European Parliament shapes EU policies. For me, see you next time.